In what ways has the Chinese Communist regime managed to deceive America and control how people talk about it? Is China still communist? And how has it exploited some of America's strategic weaknesses? Why did it take so long for the threat of communist China to become more widely recognized? And what are the key elements of the Chinese regime's strategy to achieve global dominance? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Today we sit down with Bill Gertz, who has been a national security columnist for the Washington Times for decades and is senior editor of the Washington Free Beacon. Gertz sounded the alarm about the Chinese Communist threat almost 20 years ago with his book, The China Threat. Today, he offers perspective on where things have come since then in his new book, Deceiving the Sky: Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy. We discuss Communist China's strategy of unrestricted warfare and how Western technology has been used by the Chinese regime to create its system of high-tech totalitarianism, which it tries to export globally. We also look at some of Gertz's recommendations for dealing with the Chinese communist threat. So, Bill Gertz, excellent to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Great to be here.
So, Bill, I have to give some credit where credit is due. Almost 20 years ago now, you published the book, The China Threat: How the People's Republic Targets America. And I remember reading that book, and I remember thinking, there is someone else who understands this. You have a new book out, Deceiving the Sky. So we're gonna talk about that today. But I want to ask you, you knew something 20 years ago, which no one, certainly very few Washington, D.C. establishment people seem to know. Tell me a little bit about what it's been like to see, these last 20 years go by with what you knew 20 years ago.
Well, I tell people a lot of times that I really got launched into this field after going to the Pentagon for a background briefing on the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. Back then, the Pentagon was much more press-friendly, and the Defense Intelligence Agency actually provided me with a backgrounder, and it was fairly vanilla and not real specific, but at the end of the briefing, a colonel came in and said, the general would like to see you. And so the general turned out to be the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Okay. And he sat at the end of a conference table, and we're in this windowless room in the Pentagon, and he said to me, Bill, China's not a threat. And my journalistic instincts were immediately to ask him, well, why do you think that? And his reply was, and I'm paraphrasing, was basically because the Chinese say they're not a threat. And this was, to me, really astounding to the extent to which I feel that China has been able to influence perceptions in the United States. And it's also part of a deception effort on the part of the communist regime in China. Fast forward a couple of years after that, and a couple of books, and including The China Threat, which you mentioned, I found out why the general had this incorrect view of China. And it turns out that there was a Chinese spy inside the DIA. His name was Ron Monteperdo. He was convicted of passing classified information to two Chinese military attachés at the Chinese embassy. And so I realized it was bad influence, that this spy was a very influential analyst, and he had influenced a number of other analysts throughout the U.S. intelligence community. So that really got me into sounding the alarm about this idea of Chinese deception, the idea that China is not really a nuclear-armed communistic dictatorship that it is, but is something else, that is a benign power that's seeking friendly relations with the West and the United States.
So, this situation that you're describing right now actually kind of persisted for decades. I can't remember what year he was convicted, but it was a while ago. Mm-hmm. Even up until recently, like even going back 3, 4, 5 years ago, I remember this being the general approach. And even when things were known, and you detail some of this in the book, even some very cyber warfare capability and action and so forth, it was kept very, very hush-hush. Over 20 years, since this book. Why is that?
Well, I describe it as a 30-year gamble made by the United States. This idea that if we engage in China, and by engagement I mean if we do business with them, and if we moderate our policies and we don't criticize China, and if we're nice to the communist regime in Beijing, that this would create a benign non-communist power. And this gamble has been an utter disaster, stretching back more than 30 years. I trace the origins of it to Henry Kissinger's Cold War era idea of playing the China card, which was a strategic gambit. The U.S. aligned with China, again, bailing out the Communist Party once again, that it has done several times. But then when the Soviet Union fell in December of 1991, there was no reevaluation of this policy, and it kind of continued on autopilot. And then it kind of accelerated during the Clinton administration, where we saw admission of China to the WTO, again based on a gamble that, well, even though it's not a market economy, that if we just trade with them, it will become a market economy. But I point out to people that one of the real disasters of the engagement policy has to do with the spread of nuclear weapons. One of the Clinton administration's initiatives was to do nuclear cooperation with nuclear laboratories. The U.S. would send nuclear scientists to China. China would send nuclear scientists here. Within a very few short years of that program, the CIA concluded in a public assessment that secrets related to every deployed nuclear warhead in the U.S. arsenal was stolen by China through espionage. And so we lost this valuable nuclear technology. Not only that, China shared this technology with Pakistan. And then Pakistan, through the AQ-Khan nuclear supplier network, spread this technology to North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Libya. And we're still dealing with the after effects of that. This is the kind of unfettered engagement that has been a disaster for American national security.
You would think that at that moment, when this public assessment came out, there'd be a shift in policy?
Well, there was, and it was kind of brought on by, actually, the FBI botched the main Chinese espionage case back then. It was launched against a Los Alamos National Laboratory nuclear scientist
named
year
was this?
Wen-Ho Lee. This was in the late 1990s.
Yeah.
And the FBI mishandled the case, and Wen-Ho Lee was finally convicted of mishandling some of the most sensitive secret information, but he was never convicted as a spy for China. He then was able to sue several news organizations at the time, claiming that this was persecution based on anti-Asian racism. So that kind of gives you a sense of how difficult it is to deal with this problem of communist China.
No, it's incredible. So let's go into the 2000s and Clinton era granting of MFN status, most favored nation status for those that are familiar with the jargon. I've had this question in my mind. What do you think, as a perennial China expert, was more damaging to America, the granting of MFN status and then a lot of voluntary technology transfer in a whole range of areas, which I guess started around that time as part of the goodwill and so forth, and then of course this rampant IP theft, to the tune of hundreds of billions a year that you described that we're familiar with. It strikes me, these are both very difficult things. What do you think is the kicker here?
Clearly the technology theft. Really what happened was at the very end of the Cold War, in the late 80s, Ronald Reagan discovered that the Soviet Union was highly dependent on US and Western technology. And so a major effort was put in place to block technology from going there. And it was very successful. It contributed materially to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist government studied that, and they took a completely different approach. Their deception was, we're not a communist power, we're a friendly power, we want to be friends with the United States. And that began this 30-year integration. So they presented a friendly face, but behind the scenes, they were engaged in massive theft of American technology and know-how. Again, this has gone on with literally no pushback from successive administrations throughout the 2000s, leading up until the Trump administration, where finally the president, Trump, was the first one to say, no nation can survive when upwards of $600 billion a year in technology is being stolen by a foreign power and being used by that power to modernize its economic system and to use it against the United States.
How long has America known that this is going on?
Well, it's been known, I think, clearly since the mid-2000s, and that was when the National Security Agency first was able to break into Chinese communications and realize what was going on. I talk about it in Deceiving the Sky. That was codenamed Byzantine Hades. Right. And this was the case of Chinese cyber attacks, and they were very, very successful. A lot of it has been played down or hidden. Again, the U.S. policy, I haven't seen the presidential directives. They're probably still classified, but I'm convinced that there were clear directives from within the highest levels of the U.S. government that said, we will not publicly state that China is stealing our technology. We will not do this. Law enforcement was discouraged from going after Chinese technology spies. That's all changed. We're right now in the midst of a major crackdown on Chinese, both traditional espionage as well as economic espionage.
Right. It's still going to be astounding. It's still astounding to me, having been watching this, and I'm sure it's astounding to our viewers. How could it take so long? You know, it's almost like it was happening with impunity for at least a decade. Mm-hmm. It feels like that.
Yeah, I think the president got the message very early on. I recount in Deceiving the Sky a meeting that was held in Trump Tower shortly after President Trump was elected, before he was inaugurated, where he brought together all the top technology executives from Google, Apple, Facebook, all of them. And he was going to ask them all, what's your concerns? What can we do to work together? And all of these top tech leaders said their main threat was losing intellectual property to China, and that the U.S. government needed to do more. And so that's part of that was part of the initial China strategy of the Trump administration, to take a harder line on this kind of activity.
Fascinating. So what does Deceiving the Sky mean? Where does that come from? Deceiving
the Sky is part of ancient Chinese strategy. As I describe in Deceiving the Sky, Chinese ideology today is a mixture of Soviet origin, Marxism, Leninism, and traditional Chinese ideas and concepts. And one of those is the idea of military strategy based on a period from the Warring States era. This was the period roughly 400 BC to 200 BC. Mm-hmm. And many people are very familiar with Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategist. He was from around that period. His focus was mainly on intelligence, how to defeat your enemy without firing a shot. Deceiving the Sky comes from a book called The 36 Strategies, which is dated from around 200 BC. And the number one of the 36 strategies is deceive the sky to cross the ocean. And it's basically a story about how a military commander was able to deceive the emperor himself in order to achieve a military objective. And the story is that this military commander wanted the emperor to go to war with a neighboring kingdom. And the emperor was reluctant to do that, so the military leader arranged for a dinner at a wealthy peasant's home. And when the emperor came to the wealthy peasant's home, he stepped into the house and felt the house move. And what in reality was that this was a boat, and the emperor and the general sailed away off. So the emperor had to decide, should he go to war or return back? And he decided to go to war. And so the meaning here is that in order to achieve your victory, you must be willing to deceive the emperor, who in Chinese culture is considered heaven or even God. So you must be willing to deceive God himself in order to achieve your military objectives. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Communist China is doing today in its dealings with the United States.
So, one of your first chapters, I found this very interesting, was, I think it's titled Communists Lie, or something very, very close to that, or the Communist Lie. Explain to me why you have a whole chapter dedicated to this idea.
I have been writing about these issues extensively. I went through the body of my material on China and national security affairs over the past 20 years, and it was truly an incredible amount of really eye-opening stories that were groundbreaking and totally eye-opening in terms of highlighting the China threat. So I had so much material. What I decided to do was to focus on case studies. And I took a number of case studies, and one of the case studies, again, it was on how communists lie, was to identify China's reaction to a seminal event in the history of national security affairs, and that was the 2007 anti-satellite missile test.
Right.
And I went throughout, and I had a lot of material on this. So I highlighted how China had deceived the world, mainly the United States, about this test. And what happened was, in this test, they fired a missile at an aging weather satellite, and it created a massive debris field, which right now threatens both spacecraft and orbiting space stations, and will for over 100 years. And so this, how China reacted to that, first was they lied about it. And I point out that this is the key reaction of communist regimes, is they lie, then they deceive, then they mislead. And so I felt it was important to set the stage by that. And it also highlighted this idea of China's space weapons, which I go into in great detail in the book.
So, this is another interesting thing in your book is a number of analysts or people who are experts, folks who are even very clear that China is an authoritarian state, that I've spoken with, don't really believe China is communist, yet you go out of your way to outline how it's definitely Marxist-Leninist with these Chinese characteristics. And again, I'm wondering why you felt important to outline that, and what are the implications?
Sure. It reminds me of a debate that took place in New York City a number of years ago, and there were two sides, and the debate question was, is China a threat? And on the side that agreed that China's a threat was myself and Mike Pillsbury and another expert, and on the China is not a threat was Stapleton Roy and another who is a former diplomat who is steeped in the pro-China view, and an American businessman. And after the debate, the businessman came up to me and he said, "Bill, I don't understand why you are making the case that China's a communist system. I've been doing business in China for 20 years,
right,
and I've never met a communist." And my response to him was, well, I think you should visit the PLA Museum in Beijing, which I had the fortune to visit. And if someone goes to that museum in Beijing, they will see statues of the communist founding leaders, including Mao, Stalin, Lenin, Marx, and Engels. So it's clear that, again, this deception by China that it's not communist is very important. And my point in writing Deceiving the Sky was to really highlight and help people understand the problem. That, to me, that's really the first step in finding solutions for how to deal with it. So, for example, I've been urging the Trump administration, the most important thing they could do right now would be to publish a book-length white paper on the nature of the Communist Party of China. I often tell people when I talk about China, the China threat is not the Chinese people, it's the Chinese Communist Party. And a Chinese general, a colonel, one time visited me at the Washington Times, and I made that point to him, and he was totally adamant that there is no difference between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. And this is, again, another major deception. So it's important, I feel, to really highlight this issue of Chinese communist ideology.
So, Bill, you mentioned how you use case studies robustly in the book. And there's one particular one that jumped out at me, and there are aspects to it that I didn't even realize, and I'm quite familiar with the case, and that's Gu Wangui, the Chinese billionaire that sought asylum here. Can you just give me a quick thumbnail of that and what an astounding, comprehensive example it is of how much effort and what kind of power the Chinese Communist Party can yield.
Yeah. The chapter on Chinese influence operations focuses on the case of Guo Wengui. Guo is a exiled Chinese billionaire living in New York, and he has become kind of public enemy number one by the Communist Party of China. And it's an amazing story of how they've tried to discredit him, and how they've tried to have him forcibly repatriated back to China through a number of different avenues, including using the Interpol agency to put false red notices, which is a common practice of authoritarian regimes to go after dissidents. They did that twice in the case of Guo. But I think the case that I highlight in the book has to do with a key player in Malaysia. Jotep Lo is his name, also known as Joe Lo, and he's a fugitive believed to be living in Shanghai at this point, but he's linked to a banking scandal in Malaysia called 1MDB.
Okay.
And he, in addition to this, he's been involved with the Chinese government, and through a series of hacked emails that were made public, we learned about a $3 billion operation involving a former Republican Party financier named Elliot Broidy and his wife, who were basically in connection with the Malaysians and the Chinese to forcibly have Guo first repatriated to a Persian Gulf state and then back to China. In exchange, the Chinese government was offering to pay perhaps up to $3 billion. And it led Guo to quip that he's the only dissident who has a $3 billion price tag on his head.
It's incredible how much influence the Chinese Communist Party can yield, especially being able to offer these kinds of sums to motivate people.
Well, it's like I say, they have been very aggressive in literally buying up former officials. They can buy politicians. They can covertly contribute to members of Congress political campaigns. But I think it's through former officials and businesses that they've had the most influence. I know that China has used its American companies doing business in China. They will go to those companies and they'll say, we don't like this legislation that's being drafted on Hong Kong, and we expect you as a friend of China and someone who's doing business in China, and if you want to continue doing business in China, you have to go to the Congress and lobby against this legislation. This is a common tactic. It needs to be exposed. I hope to be doing some of that kind of reporting in the future to look at some of this in-depth influence operations of the Chinese Communist government.
Fascinating. So tell me a little bit about your take on what the United Front Work Department is then, speaking of influence.
Well, United Front Work Department is a quasi-intelligence organization. It's a party organization, and it dates back to the old Soviet Union days when they had what was called United Front Work. Under the current supreme leader in China, Xi Jinping, we've seen an acceleration of what is known as United Front Work. And this is, again, influence peddling operations. They've surfaced to a great extent in Australia. They're beginning to be shown here in the United States. I highlight the October 2018 speech of Vice President Mike Pence, where he talked about how China is working against Trump's reelection. He said that basically the Chinese have decided they want a different president. And this is the work of the United Front Work Department, which again, its activities have been expanded under Xi Jinping. It's essentially political warfare / intelligence operations designed to promote the Communist Party of China's strategic objectives.
So that actually reminds me, something else you mention in the book is this concept of unrestricted warfare. This is something we've covered a lot at the Epoch Times, but it's still, for Americans, for many Americans, it feels like a kind of an esoteric and unclear concept. Can you kind of expand on, because of course, the Chinese Communist Party employs unrestricted warfare. What does that mean exactly?
Yes, Unrestricted Warfare was a book that was written by two PLA colonels in 1999. And again, so this was, 20 years ago, but it has been adopted to a large extent as those colonels and their generation advanced to the higher ranks of the PLA. They have adopted many of these concepts. Unrestricted warfare means all forms warfare. And again, it goes back to ancient Chinese strategy of things like assassin's mace weaponry.
Okay.
During the Warring States era, it was essential. Military strategists were constantly figuring out how does a weaker power destroy a stronger power. And in the current context, that's what the PLA is doing regarding the United States. And they have developed a great number of these niche warfare capabilities, to mention just a few: space weaponry, cyber warfare, and advanced missiles. For example, hypersonic missiles that travel so fast that they can outrun even anti-missile interceptors.
Assassin's mace, so you're talking about basically weapons that have no response, right, that are being developed.
They are weapons that allow a weaker power to defeat a stronger power through its vulnerabilities. For example, the United States faces a major strategic vulnerability in its satellites.
Okay.
With as few as 30 anti-satellite missiles or ground-based lasers or orbiting killer robot satellites, the Chinese could cripple the United States, not just the military, but the entire U.S. society, because we're so dependent on those satellites for everything from communications to that little dot you see on your phone whenever you are looking for GPS directions, banking information. So this is an extreme vulnerability. The Pentagon is trying to figure out ways to protect those satellites, but most of the satellites that we've deployed over the past 20 or 30 years are highly vulnerable to attack. And in the case of China, as I mentioned, in 2007, they blew up a satellite that created a massive debris field. The next time, they won't do that. In a future conflict, what they will do, and the experts at the Pentagon tell me that the best way to disable a satellite without creating that debris is to fire a laser from the ground, a high-powered laser. And that would create, all you have to do is to heat up the electronics or the optics on a satellite, and you can basically put it out of operation.
So you have a section in the book which describes this futuristic scenario, which I think begins with one of these laser blasts. Tell, why did you include that?
I have two fictional scenarios in the book, and I felt it was important to do that because it's important how do you highlight some of these things that haven't happened yet but are very likely to happen in the future. Okay. And so for that reason, I presented how China would conduct a surprise attack on the United States, and that one of the first things they would do would be to disable the missile warning satellites that we have. That is one of our assassin's mace weapons, the ability to detect a missile launch any place on the planet. And by using a combination of deception and laser attacks, they could take out the satellite and then successfully conduct a surprise strategic missile strike, kind of what I describe as a global Pearl Harbor.
You also describe, speaking of the space warfare, one of the satellites that the Chinese deployed, which actually has this small satellite which has a retractable arm that can zoom. This is one of these robotic satellites that you're describing.
Yes, and they're working very, very, very rapidly on developing these weapons. You know, the U.S. has recognized it, and the Pentagon recently created a U.S. Space Command. But guess what? We have a Space Command with no weapons. At least none that we're aware of. The U.S. has a nascent anti-satellite capability that was demonstrated in 2008 when there was a falling National Reconnaissance Office satellite. And in order to prevent that satellite from impacting any place on Earth and possibly endangering populations, we modified one of our Navy anti-missile interceptors to become an anti-satellite weapon, and we're able to shoot down that satellite. So we've demonstrated the capabilities, but as of right now, we have no announced weapons that are capable of either countering these robotic satellites that China has, or dealing with the laser effects, or dealing with a ground-based anti-satellite missile.
I imagine that this new Space Command, Space Forces, folks are working overtime to deal with this question, right?
It's a very high priority for the Pentagon. I know that, and Congress has also plussed up their budget very much to be able to address these threats.
Let's talk about intelligence for a sec. So this is a case that I think many people have heard of in general, but don't understand the depth of the cost to America. I guess there's some debate about how it was actually done, and there were multiple channels, but this kind of compromising of the network of U.S. assets in China, and many of them disappearing or being killed. Can you just
This is a disaster of strategic proportions. It began somewhere around 2010. What happened was that the CIA began noticing that it was losing its recruited agents inside China. Now, if you understand American intelligence, they have missions, and the CIA's mission is to be the human intelligence gathering managers. Their job is to basically to spy and steal secrets. And of course, China is one of the most important strategic targets. It's been identified. It hasn't been that until recently, but back in 2010, it was not again. And what happened was the Chinese intelligence service, primarily the Ministry of State Security, which is the main civilian intelligence service, began rolling up CIA assets to the tune of as many as 30 of these agents who were basically either imprisoned or some of them even executed. In one case, according to American officials, they put one of them out in a courtyard of one of the intelligence agencies and executed him in public. How that happened is either a combination of traitors, spies within the CIA who are able to reveal these, and I think the most likely suspect there is a former CIA officer named Jerry Changxin Li, who pleaded guilty not too long ago to being a spy for China. Li was not charged with compromising agents, but when the FBI, before they arrested him as part of a multi-year investigation, they found in his hotel room in Hawaii, as part of the investigation, a notebook containing the names and identities of recruited CIA assets. So they believe that this was how they were lost. On the other hand, there was a debate that there was a compromise of ultra-secret CIA communications. The CIA has an ability to communicate with agents on various levels. They have a two-tiered system, and one of the first-tiered system basically is for agent recruits. That is, the people that have not been formally invited into the inner circle of being a recruited agent. Right. And then they have a second system for dedicated recruits, those that have been vetted and determined. And somehow or other, either the systems got combined and there was a compromise and they lost those agents. So it was either that communications failure, and again, there was a related case related to the Middle East. An Air Force intelligence officer defected to Iran and disclosed a similar system where all of the agents in Iran were rolled up by the Iranian government. So this really left the American government in the dark at a crucial period in American history. That period from 2010 on, they're now rebuilding, but it's certainly not going to be easy to recruit people now. This story has come out, and then the question is, who would be willing to risk their life to spy for the CIA if they can't keep their identity secret, either from communications or from traitors?
It's staggering, right? When you really think about it. Another piece, and I'm not going to go through your entire book because I'm going to recommend it, to everyone here to read, because I think it's a very, fairly short book that is also comprehensive and gives kind of a pretty broad picture. I think you call it high-tech totalitarianism. Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, a model that is also being exported.
Yes.
I've often told people, George Orwell couldn't have imagined the technologies that are available today, that are actually in use in China today. Can you expand a little bit
Sure. I have a chapter of the book called High-Tech Totalitarianism, and I felt it was important to do this because, again, as part of China's drive for global supremacy is that they want to export this high-tech totalitarian system to the entire world. And so it was important, I felt, to at least begin to let people know the kinds of things that they're doing. First, they have a social credit system, which is, I think, in kind of the early stages of its repressive features. And this is a system whereby anyone perceived by the party regime in China to be in any way nonconformist, politically unreliable, they don't get to travel. So if you want to travel by train or by air, you can't travel. I think they're going to expand it in many other ways, such as not being able to get housing or not being able to buy food. So it's certainly troubling. I think we're seeing, I think, the greatest mass repression right now in Western China, where in the area known as East Turkestan, or what China refers to as Xinjiang, where we see between 1 and 2 million people are being placed in concentration camps. Recent photos have showed some of these operations. China is using technology, a lot of it stolen from the United States, for facial recognition to identify people that they want to do surveillance and use it as a control mechanism. The ultimate objective of all this high-tech totalitarianism is ultimately control. I remember back in the Clinton administration, they opened the floodgates of American technology and they encouraged China to develop its internet. And I remember Bill Clinton, and I mentioned this in the book, Bill Clinton saying that trying to control the internet is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Well, the Chinese are very close to nailing Jell-O to the wall in terms of their control of the internet, as well as bigger information and population control writ large.
Yeah, I thought that was a very funny thing to mention, but absolutely, absolutely. In your mind today, and I've heard a lot of debates, we've seen it in the recent presidential primary debates on the Democratic side, what's a bigger threat, Russia or China?
Without doubt, it's China. I mean, to me, I recently watched a program on cable news where they had the Democratic presidential candidates all mouthing the similar thing, that climate change was an existential threat, and they used the same term, existential threat. The real existential threat, in my view, is communist China, and I'm doing everything I can to alert people to that. Russia is a threat as well, but it's a different kind of threat. It's a threat. I mean, if you just look at the economy of Russia versus the economy of China, Russia's economy is 7 times smaller. It's a declining power. They have major demographic issues. Their problem is they've become anti-U.S. under Vladimir Putin, and they're developing new nuclear weapons, new means of deliveries of those in frightening ways. But I think that if the United States were to basically pressure that regime, they could change it, and we could play the Russia card like Kissinger played the China card against China, and I think ultimately that's something that needs to be done.
You mentioned, global dominance. I think that the Chinese Communist Party officials maintain, we're just doing everything defensively to help ourselves, to overcome decades of being treated poorly by the West. What do you make of that?
It's a major deception. Yeah, the Chinese have plans to expand their system, even economically. They would like to replace the dollar-based global economic system with a yuan-based system. They want their currency to do that. We see them expanding through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a multi-trillion-dollar investment program, which I regard as really a Trojan horse of Chinese expansionism and drive for global dominance. For example, they're going into developing countries, and they will tell these poor developing countries, we'd like to build a railroad for you as part of infrastructure development. And so they said, we'll even lend you the money. And then they lend the money at an exorbitant interest rate. And when the country can't pay the debt, the Chinese will then come in and say, well, that railroad is now ours. And in this way, they're literally buying up and taking over countries. And I think they have a strategy to try to encircle the United States and perhaps Europe with their system. And again, this brings in the whole idea of cornering the market on 5G, advanced telecommunications technology.
Right, because the same thing you just described with trains and rail, in telecom, it's basically the Huawei model is coming in pretty much exactly as you described.
Yeah, I have a chapter on Huawei and 5G, and it is a major concern. The first thing people need to understand is that 5G is not simply a step up from 4G. It's rather a revolutionary technology change in terms of the ability to move data and communicate rapidly, ultra rapidly. And whoever corners the market on that, and the Chinese are trying to do that by establishing their technical specifications for infrastructure related to 5G around the world. The U.S. is at somewhat of a disadvantage in that we don't have state companies. I know that Rob Spalding, when he was at the White House, offered a plan that would have called for a U.S. government-backed plan to compete with China directly in the 5G field. I kind of agree with that. I think we need that.
Kind of got him in trouble, right?
Well, I guess so. I don't know. I mean, yeah, the telecommunications companies were not happy with that, but I don't think it got him in too much trouble. I think it was a pretty good idea. He's obviously written extensively and spoken out about it publicly.
Bill, you mentioned how policy has dramatically changed under the Trump administration. Yet, there are a lot of people out there that have stuck to the same ideas that you've been describing have been prevalent for 20, 30 years. How is that possible given all the evidence, the preponderance of evidence?
Well, I think it's a tribute to Chinese intelligence and the United Front Work Department information deception operations to really fool the American public. And then I think that there are kind of willing kind of fellow travelers, if you will, who just view the communist China as the model that they admire. And I think that's entirely possible when you look at kind of what's happening on college campuses today. You know, communism around the world has been largely discredited, except on American college campuses, where you have Marxist professors who are pushing the notion that the United States is the cause of all the world's problems, that it's the United States that's the problem. Of course, that's a complete lie. I mean, if anyone to look objectively at this society and what it has produced just over the last 50 years, it's just an extraordinary thing that this free and open society has produced the greatest wealth in the history of humankind.
How big are the Chinese Communist Party lobbying efforts in Washington?
Very strong. I mean, aside from their official lobbying, they have unofficial lobbyists. They have interest groups. They have committees of people who are considered, quote, friends of China. And China has been able to manipulate these groups, often by access to China. For example, if you're an expert on China at one of the think tanks, your job would be to travel to China. But China tightly controls its access to the country. No one can travel to China if they're regarded as not a friend of China. For example, myself, I've been able to travel to China on a number of occasions, most recently in June of 2018, where I traveled with the Secretary of Defense to Beijing. But for others, you can't get into the country if you don't toe the Friend of China line. And again, they've done this through buying up officials, through United Front Work Department work. It's an extensive effort.
So how did you manage to get in?
Well, the Pentagon actually told me that they were concerned that I wouldn't be able to get a visa. But I found that it's very difficult for the Chinese to deny a visa. This would have been the first visit by the Secretary of Defense during the Trump administration, and to block someone from visiting with him would have been...
Who's part of the party, right?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. You've outlined, Bill, a very, very difficult situation, I think, for America, as I see it. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of evidence that the Chinese economy. There's a bit of deception around the realities of the Chinese. When I say a bit, I actually mean a lot. And things aren't nearly as rosy as the Chinese Communist Party has painted it on the Chinese side. So you describe kind of this opportunity, in a sense, for America to act and stop this aggression that you're describing. Can you tell me more about how this works?
Well, what is to be done is the title of my conclusion in the book. I think the first thing is we need to be able to tell the truth about Communist China, which is something we have not been able to do for many years. I think we need to liberate the Chinese people. I think I dedicated the book to the Chinese people because they do not want to live under that system. They have had a taste of what it's like to live in a free society like the United States, and they go back to their home country, and it's not free. And when I was in Beijing, I felt like it was an information desert. You could not access the common things that we do, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or those kinds of things. And the Chinese Communist Party tries to control all of the information. So my thing is we've gone part of the way in identifying China as a strategic competitor or adversary, but not as a real enemy. And I think that we need to do that first. We need to be clear on the nature of the threat. And then we can begin taking the kind of steps that can mitigate this threat and what we can do. What China needs is a democratic political reform. And that will never happen as long as the Communist Party of China is in power. The party has issued numerous papers. I remember one of my visits back in the early 2000s where while I was visiting with one of, I think it was Vice President Cheney, they issued a paper saying that China will never adopt Western democracy. And yet the West has kept this fiction that we're going to trade, they'll figure it out, and eventually they'll adopt a democratic system. We need to expose the Communist Party of China as a first step and then help them make a transition. Hopefully better than we did in the case of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. My own view is I think the Chinese party understands that their model is unsustainable and that they've been looking for something. That's why they lack a value system. The party has no values other than its political support for the Communist Party. That's why they export toothpaste with antifreeze or pet food that kills pets overseas. And so they understand that they're lacking an underlying value system. But ultimately, I think we need to change the Communist Party of China.
So in addition to these economic measures that we're seeing the current administration is taking, and indeed quite a significant change in the perception of China within government and so forth, what other concrete policy recommendations?
Well, yeah, one of the key things that we need to do is we need to establish a policy of strict reciprocity as it relates to China. And that's something that hasn't been done. We did that again in the Reagan administration relation to the Soviet Union. It started with reciprocal restraints on diplomats, but it extended to media. For example, Chinese media operate freely here in the United States, and a large percentage of those personnel involved in state-controlled media are intelligence personnel. Yet the United States has strict restrictions on its reporters that operate in China. They're frequently thrown out. If they write about Xi Jinping's family, they're expelled. So we should make it very clear that there has to be reciprocity, a strict reciprocity, so that for every reporter that's allowed to report here freely, the same access has to be provided to American and Western reporters in China. And if they don't, then we should kick them out. Another recommendation is to create a democratic parliament in exile, that is, bring together democracy activists, whether they're from Hong Kong or China or other places, and have them formulate free and open democratic policies for China. Have them meet once a year, record the proceedings, publish them, and then circulate them within China and saying, this is what China needs to do for real political reform.
Very interesting. Bill Gertz, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.